Tonight, we won't open dusty chronicles to read about kings or battles. We'll turn instead to a page where time itself hesitates, where the numbers don't quite fit, and the years seem to lean into each other like tired books on a crooked shelf. Not history set in stone, but history with soft edges, pliable enough to fold, or even to invent, because some say entire centuries, 3 of them, were quietly slipped into the record. Not with fanfare, but with the slow, deliberate strokes of a drowsy scribe's pen. Years that may never have existed, yet still appear in every calendar, ticking softly alongside the real ones. Tonight, we'll linger in that strange pause between truth and imagination. We'll listen to the quiet shuffle of parchment, the faint sigh of an ink line drying, and the rustle of a ledger keeping secrets it was never meant to tell Dot, so lower the lights. Let the room settle around you. And if your breathing falls into step with the slow march of those missing years, that's just time walking at your pace, Dot. If gentle mysteries like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next story will find you exactly where you are. Now, Dot asterisk, we begin with the clock set wrong, which is not unusual. You have probably kept a microwave clock blinking the wrong time for months and survived. The Julian calendar, offered by Julius Caesar, assumed the year was neatly 365.25 days. Nature disagreed by a sliver, about 11 minutes and 14 seconds shy. A small oversight, the kind that would not bother you at all until it shuffled. Easter gradually across the spring like a bored chess piece. The difference meant that every 128 years or so, the date drifted a full day. By the time people were carving 1582 into lintels, the spring equinox had slipped 10 days away from where church tables wanted it. The remedy came as the Gregorian reform, which was really an administrative sigh. In Catholic lands, Thursday, October 4th, 1582, went to bed and woke up Friday. October 15th, people lost 10 days and gained an on-time equinox. A fair trade, unless your birthday lived in those non-existent dates and you had planned cake. You can picture the confusion, rent due. On a day that never happened, saints whose feast days jumped like startled finches, and a few debtors arguing politely, one likes to think that technically they were not late. The reform also pruned 3 leap days out of every 4 centuries, a sort of botanical trimming. Of February, England waited until 1752 to follow suit, a procrastination that proved traditional. Some pamphlets grumbled that the government had stolen 11 days. Never mind that the days had been drifting quietly for many lifetimes. It is always the tidy correction that is considered suspicious. This is your first micro-hook, if we can call it that, the way a small arithmetic error in Rome kept sliding. Under doors for more than a millennium, like a very slow letter, into this practical tale steps a rumor with comfortable slippers. What if the drift and the fix were not the whole story? What if an emperor, a pope, and perhaps a Byzantine colleague arranged the calendar to place themselves at the round and pleasing year 1000? The suggestion attributes to Emperor Otto III a longing many of us share to stand in a significant year and feel important, like being the first customer at a new bakery purely for the smell. Herbert Illig, a modern skeptic with a tidy fondness for subtraction, proposed that roughly 297 years were added to history. According to this thought, parts of late antiquity were folded like laundry and rehung as the Middle Ages, crisp and fabricated. One does not need to accept the claim to enjoy its flavor. It is the kind of historical bedtime snack that crumbles without making a mess. Consider how such a trick would play, at least on paper. An emperor issues charters with dates everyone politely agrees to use. A pope supports the arithmetic with ecclesiastical tables that tell you when to fast and when to feast, which is already a compelling reason to nod along. A Byzantine court chronicles the same numbers in faultless Greek. After a while, those numbers feel worn in. The year 1000 arrives right on schedule. Candles are lit, bells are rung, and somewhere a clerk quietly updates the list of royal gifts with a careful +1. If you prefer a modern analogy, think of how a software update silently fixes the time zone on your phone. You do not notice until your alarm cooperates. Centuries are like that. They sneak by while breakfast cools. The missing empire lives in the next soft room of our slow walk. Between 614 and 911, the shelves look sparse to impatient eyes. There are fewer chronicles than one expects, fewer monumental buildings that survive, fewer new legal codes with impressive prologues. It is not empty, just quiet, like a library at lunch. Some monasteries were busy enough, copying texts, brewing something brown and patient, arranging relics in boxes with tiny windows. But compared to the boom of earlier Roman stone and later Gothic ambition, these centuries can feel like the house when a party ends and only the coat rack remains crowded. This is the period that the hypothesis identifies as mostly imagined. A cardboard insert where a statue should be. The phrase Dark Ages did not help, of course. It suggests someone forgot to pay the electric bill. Artifacts that never were get cited like absent guests. Where are the grand inscriptions shouting about glorious victories? Where the bustling new cities? Where the fashion plates of the year 731? But history's survival is not a fair census. Wood rots. Parchment gets reused. Stone is pilfered for. Barns. A chronicle can vanish because a stove needed lighting during a wet spring. Even coins, those hardy metal emails, can be melted into something more useful, like a clasp for your cloak. Sometimes our absence is merely the result of someone's competence at reusing. There's a parchment in the British Library over which a biblical text was written with the faint ghost of an older legal treatise beneath, a palimpsest as subtle as a second yawn. If it is hard to imagine people not noticing centuries being invented, it is equally hard to imagine how carefully real years can be lost to chewing goats and sensible recycling. Still, the idea lingers that silence equals fiction. Elik pointed out that some buildings said to be Carolingian look suspiciously ahead of their time, as if 12th century styles had wandered in early. Perhaps renovations confused things, or restorers with eager chisels made choices that history would later mistake for medieval taste. It happens. Museums today sell replicas so faithful that a curator must label them after the original, a phrase that resembles a polite apology. On winter nights, anyone who has ever mislabeled a spice jar understands the temptation to write cinnamonish and be done with it. The centuries under suspicion can look cinnamonish to those expecting nutmeg. The church and the calendar are forever married in the ledger, and their quarrels sound like arithmetic. The Vatican's grip on time, as critics phrase it, arose not from secrecy but from logistics. Easter needed to land in the correct spring. Lent had to hurry along on time so fishmongers could plan, and so families would not unexpectedly find themselves eating eggs on a day when eggs were frowned upon. Tables of computus were composed, full of lunar cycles and sun cycles and those soothing golden numbers, which today look like Sudoku for bishops. In such a world, tinkering with dates could feel natural, like sweeping a doorstep, and not like treason. Yet the hypothesis suspects something grander, that the church, with state help, swept away a rather large chunk of hallway and then painted a floor where there had been a stair. The celestial edits offer another pillow to fuss with. Medieval chroniclers recorded comets and eclipses, as one does when the sky suddenly behaves like a theater. These entries help modern historians anchor dates, because the heavens follow rules even when people do not. If an eclipse is observed at a certain monastery and again in another town, the alignment can be checked against astronomical models. The results, like a diligent librarian stamp, usually affirm the standard timeline. The objection that someone edited those reports later is a little like accusing a star chart of collusion, but bedtime allows it as a gentle what if. One can picture a scholar with a quill, sighing, and adding a note, also seen over mites. The inks line up, the centuries breathe a little deeper. If you're still with me, take this as a micro reward. Some monks drew the tail of Halley's Comet so large that it looks like the sky was brushing its hair. Critics of phantom time, who are not loud but are firm, bring out dendrochronology, the counting of tree rings. Each summer a quiet band of wood, like stacked vinyl records. They bring radiocarbon dating, which is a very slow hourglass that happens to be made of nitrogen and cosmic rays. They bring ice cores where layers of snow fall and keep their own diary. These methods agree with each other more often than rival. Siblings, and they place events roughly where tradition places them. But notice the sleep-friendly beauty here. To answer a question about an emperor's vanity, one consults wooden beams from church roofs and pollen frozen in old lakes, and the memory of a glacier. It is such a modest coalition that it nearly tucks itself in. We could stay in archives, yet the most soothing part is how historians themselves argue in whispers across decades. Those who challenge the received centuries are not villains. They're that friend who asks the waiter whether the menu's house. Time is seasonal. Some point to thinly attested rulers, where a king exists in name but not in stories, and wonder if those rulers were ever real. Others note that medieval scribes like to copy, and copying can lift mistakes forward the way a stray crumb travels 3 plates. Even those who dismiss the hypothesis entirely sympathize with the itch that produced it. When faced with gaps, the brain wants to paste in neutral wallpaper. A chronicle that reads, in that year, nothing remarkable, may be the most honest. Entry in history, and also the least likely to be recopied. Are we still living in 1727? It is a good late-night question because it can be answered with a shrug. If our calendars were wrong by 3 centuries, your morning coffee would taste exactly the same. Your birthday would not move houses. It would merely adopt a different neighborhood of numbers. When people in 1752 lost 11 days to the Gregorian switch, their cats continued to ignore them at the usual times. The sun still rose, without checking the Act of Parliament. If the world were secretly younger, on paper, then bridges would nevertheless stand on their abutments, and wages would still be paid on Fridays. A subtle micro-hook. One London parish in 1752 carefully rescheduled a fair so the proper saints would get their day, and a cheesemonger wrote that he had not, in fact, aged faster. This is the sort of record that warms the historian's hands. Practical, fussy, droll-dot the scholars who play with time, both the ones who subtract, and the ones who do not share an affection for footnotes that read like lullabies. Cf. Eclipse of 840. Similar weather reported by monks of St. Gall. Bread prices steady. In such pages, one learns that a medieval hour was sometimes longer in summer and shorter in winter, because daylight has its preferences, and that bells were rung not by the second, but by habit. You learn that some towns rang curfew when the evening star appeared, which is a romantic way of saying bedtime. Time itself was measured by water clocks, candle clocks, and the kind of neighbor who always knows when to set stew on the fire. If a conspiracy ever tried to move history 3 centuries sideways, it would have needed to re-wax a great many candles, and then the thought experiment, kinder than a plot twist and gentle enough to fold into a pillowcase. Suppose, for the sake of drowsiness, that a handful of centuries are a shared fiction, like a long hallway drawn on a wall. How would we feel it? Streets named after saints would keep their names. The phases of the moon would continue their quiet looping. Museums would look the same. The audio guides would simply clear their throats and say a different year, before whispering, "Please proceed to the next gallery." Perhaps the most noticeable change would be in hotel elevators, where floor numbers sometimes skip unlucky. 13. We would congratulate ourselves on having always been flexible with numbers that make us uncomfortable. One could even imagine the jubilant sale of new "I survived the recalibration" tea towels, which would be the most human outcome of all. More likely, and this is where the voice thins to a murmur phantom, time is nothing more than a cozy suspicion, the blanket you pull over your shoulders because the air moved. The archives, patient as lichens, keep telling their layered story, ring by ring in oak beams, line by line in rents collected, star by star in the night notes of men who watch the sky for God and occasionally for fun. Yet the nicest part about such hypotheses is the way they invite us to read closely. You examine a date the way you check a sleeping child's breath, gently and without haste, reassured each time by the small rise and fall. Time, whether it is perfectly counted or gently miscounted, is simply the rhythm that lets bread rise. An ink dry and the kettle remember when to sing, before the kettle does. A final micro hook to cradle. In the margins of a 9th century manuscript, a scribe drew a tiny man carrying an enormous clock. The figure's legs wobble comically under the weight, as if he is late for something in a century that may or may not exist. The clock has no numbers, only dots, like crumbs from a cake. He walks toward nothing in particular across the page, and then stops because the parchment ends. It is as good an image for history as any. We carry time more than it carries us. When we set it down, and when we lose a little of it behind the furniture, nothing shatters. The room is still here, the cat still yawns, the calendar still hangs a bit crooked because one tack is shorter than the other. Let it be, we have counted. Enough for tonight. You might not expect the calendar to have a plot, and yet here we are, listening to months turn like sleepy pages while a small argument from 15 centuries ago keeps ticking under the surface. A quill scratches. A bell somewhere counts the hours as if it were counting buttons in a drawer. Someone whispers that whole years might be padding, like extra wool tucked into a winter coat. It's very comfortable, this idea. Almost too comfortable. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part about golden numbers, epochs, and why bakers once used moon tables to plan hot cross buns, you can subscribe or follow or nod politely, but truly, do not exert yourself. The calendar is patient. We can always be late to time. Let's place the first pebble. Julius Caesar's reform, the Julian calendar, assumed a pleasingly round number, 365 days and a quarter. The Earth objected by about 11 minutes and 14 seconds. A small, almost affectionate disagreement. No one noticed at first, much as you might not notice a rug slowly creeping crooked across the floor. But centuries have a way of magnifying. Fidgets, the spring equinox slid along the dates like a drowsy cat along a couch back. Festivals strayed. Tables for Easter began to look like the work of a clerk who had lost his glasses and found, instead, a ruler with the wrong markings. By 1582, the equinox was roughly 10 days late, according to church arithmetic. So the solution arrived in one decisive sweep. After Thursday, October 4th, came Friday, October 15th. 10 dates went missing, like socks evaporated by the laundry. One could complain, of course, but the sun seemed unfazed, which is a hard witness to cross-examine. The new system, now called Gregorian, instructed February to skip a leap day 3 times every 4 centuries. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of pruning a hedge. Catholic realms adopted the shears at once, though others waited. England, being fond of stubbornness when the matter is numerical, came around in 1752 and mislaid 11 days at a stroke. There were handbills, grumbles, and the enduring rumor that crowds demanded their 11 days back with interest, as if time were a deposit you could retrieve from a drawer. Inland revenue officials made the necessary sighing adjustments. Saints' feasts politely shuffled over. Birthdays quietly rescheduled their cakes. Meanwhile, the planet's punctual show-offs continued as usual. And yet, in the corners of reading rooms and on the smoother edges of the internet, another murmur persists. Perhaps some centuries never really happened. Perhaps the story goes, and Emperor Otto III is the usual volunteer wanted to inhabit. The splendid year 1000, a round number with the taste of importance. To arrange this, he and a pope and a Byzantine partner supposedly pushed the calendar forward by almost 300 years. An audacious bookkeeping flourish that might have made auditors proud if auditors enjoyed metaphysics. A thought like this has the softness of winter light. It lets us play with years like beads. Imagine dignitaries agreeing on a new line of dates, much as one agrees on the spelling of a borrowed word, by writing it several times and nodding at the result. One must give the theory its bedtime fairness. Dates in any age are social habits. If a ruler minted the year, scribes recorded it, priests preached it, and merchants stamped it on contracts. Once enough parchment carried the same number, the number felt inevitable. Who would, in the 9th century, argue with a year when bread needed baking and cattle needed kilning? The hypothetical trick depends on this ordinary obedience. It also depends on a certain desire for beautiful numbers. We do love millennia, jubilees, and roundness. Even today we celebrate 10-year challenges and feel a little thrill at 2:22 on 2:20 seconds, as if time had looked into a mirror just for us. Otto, the story goes, wanted that thrill in stone and gold. He could have simply declared it, but declamation lacks the charm of conspiracy. Hence the whisper about 300 borrowed years. Now we drift into quieter territory, the supposed missing centuries between 614 and 911. To some eyes, the period looks thin on monuments and thick with weather reports. There are fewer big inscriptions one can run a finger across. Fewer haughty new cities, fewer fashion complaints. The name Dark Ages, which historians have sighed over for a long time, comes back like a squeaky door, but then is not empty. If you peer at charters, you find land swapped for sheep, abbeys, receding vineyards one careful row at a time, local lords donating mills for the salvation of their souls, which is also convenient for flour. Monasteries hum with copying. Margins bloom with doodles of fish and fantastical birds, whose job is to keep a scribe awake. There are hospital accounts noting onions, and weather annals noting hailstones, the size of peas, which is an admirably precise vegetable for comparison. The silence, such as it is, has ordinary causes. Wood decays, and many buildings of the age were wooden. Parchment was expensive and often recycled. If a scribe needed a page for Psalm 23, he might scrape away a legal note on cheap trespass. That erased text is called a palimpsest, and it can sometimes be coaxed back with light like a faint memory. Stone, too, travels. Roman blocks are practical. For barns, columns become thresholds. Coins melt into brooches. Bells crack and become new bells. You can lose a great deal of history to the sensible habit of reuse. Archivists will tell you with a librarian's sadness that nothing to report seldom survives. We copy drama. We misplace Tuesdays. If you have ever emptied an old drawer and found only warranties for appliances that died nobly long ago, you know the texture of these centuries. Those who argue for a phantom time point at styles that seem to leap ahead. Buildings that look suspiciously later, chronicles that double. Themselves. Perhaps renovations and later repairs have fooled our eyes. Perhaps the datings jumped when someone misread Roman numerals, a not uncommon sign. 6 and 4 feuds waiting to happen. Or perhaps catalogers in the 19th century eager to put things in neat sequences, stacked them on slightly wrong shelves. Museum labels, after all, are written by people who also forget umbrellas. My favorite microexample: a church inventory once listed 2.5 chalices, which puzzled everyone until someone found a cup without a base. One imagines the clerk shrugging, dipping his pen, and writing the fraction with confidence. Next comes the church and its calendars, married in both necessity and convenience. To know when to fast and feast, the church needed Easter, and to know Easter it needed the moon, and to know the moon it needed arithmetic kind enough for clergy who also had sheep to supervise. The computus that curated tangle of tables looks, at first, like a crossword puzzle in Latin. Bede worked with it, monasteries taught it. Parchment margins sprouted golden numbers 1 through 19, patiently cycling with the lunar calendar. There were epochs, which are the moon's age on New Year's Day, a number that has the cozy feeling of measuring your sourdough starter by scent rather than by weight. In this world, tweaking dates was as normal as retying a sandal. The allegation that Rome controlled time sounds grand in a pamphlet, but in practice it meant aligning the fishmonger's timetable with the heavens. What about the sky itself? Monks and court astronomers noted comets and eclipses, because when the sun behaves like a candle behind a thumb, anyone with ink nearby will make a note. Halley's comet blazed in 837 large enough in some drawings to look like the sky had unspooled a ribbon. Eclipses were written down with dutiful awe. The sun was darkened at the 3rd hour, or the moon swelled with a reddish hue, which doubles nicely as weather poetry. Modern astronomers can run those events backward with equations, like rewinding a very precise music box. The matches generally land in the centuries where tradition places them. To support phantom time, someone would have had to go through those annals and nudge many stars. Imagine the administrative burden. Dear Brother Anselm, please add a note about a comet last Tuesday. Be sure to coordinate with Seville. Even conspiracies get tired. There are also scholars who investigate the question without drama. They carry dendrochronology tree ring calendars that link the age of a beam in a church roof to the seasons when it grew, ring after ring like stacked bread plates. They carry radiocarbon dates, which are essentially the Earth's gradual exhale, captured in oak and linen. They carry layers of Greenland ice, where volcanoes leave thin ash bookmarks. These methods disagree now and then, as any siblings do, but their family resemblance is strong. They point to years roughly where the textbooks put them. It is a gentle chorus, not triumph, just consistent humming. A beam cut in the year of our Lord 741 tends to look like a beam cut in the mid-8th century when you counted summers. If a secret editor moved the dates 300 years forward, he forgot to whisper to the trees. And yet, bedtime loves a what if. What if we are, on paper, living in 1727? Your kettle would boil on schedule. Your dog would still know when dinner happens, a sense of time stronger than any parliament. The only practical change might be burst of novelty tea towels, happy corrected year. Hotels would quickly be asked whether to add a year 0 button to elevators that already skip. 13. Dentists would revise appointment cards with ceremonial pens. The tax office would implement a transitional spreadsheet, as is their way. Time is social, and we are very good at keeping it sociable. When England lost those 11 days in 1752, there were arguments about wages and rent, but the tide was undeterred. Bread rose, cats slept. A few people made jokes about losing birthdays and being suddenly younger. Jokes are also archives, historians. who question time's official furniture do the useful work of tapping the legs to see whether they wobble. One points out that certain rulers appear in lists without stories, like names carved into benches no one sat on. Another notices that script styles seem to jump. Another compares far-flung chronicles, Arabic, Chinese, Irish, and underlines where they rhyme and where they don't, even when their conclusions fail to persuade. Their footnotes add breadcrumbs to the path for everyone else. Compare eclipse in 810 with report of frost in vineyards. A note might say, the academic equivalent of leaving a low light on the landing. You do not have to believe in missing centuries to enjoy the hospitality. There are tiny absurdities along the way, rewards for staying drowsily attentive. A scribe once recorded that the sun darkened at noon, and immediately in the same hand that the monastery pig had escaped. Priorities are everything. Another wrote Easter tables so carefully that he drew a small fish where he miscopied a number, as if to say, I know. I'll sit in the margin and think about what I've done. An English parish, adjusting to the 1752 reform, moved its annual goose fair but kept the tradition of arguing about the weather on exactly the same corner. In a German town, a notary in the 16th century tried to fix a date he disliked by adding "so there," which must be the bravest legal flourish ever penned. Micro hooks, yes, but also tiny lullabies. Proof that time bends around Aaron's dot if phantom time were true. Libraries would not change their smell. Vellum would still have that faint softness of clean wardrobes. Ink would still bloom brown as it ages, the way tea strengthens if you forget it on a desk. Our perception of the year would shift, but the past would not move an inch. The Carolingians would still write careful Latin. Byzantines would still shimmer in mosaics. Merchants on the Baltic would still argue politely over barrels of herrings. That, by now, have become all metaphor. You could stand before a church tympanum and think 9th, 12th, and then remember that the stone does not mind your uncertainty. It knows rain and sun and the feeling of starlings landing. It has tenure. All of this returns us to the first whisper. Calendars are stories we tell to make the sun's path conversational. Caesar's guess was close, the church's correction was better, and the hypothesis of stolen centuries is a good, cozy fireside puzzle that gives us permission to read, slowly, the small print. We find marginal notes about fish. We find oak, beams with rings like the grooves of old records. We find comets sketched as messy brooms. We find, pleasingly, receipts. A world that saved its receipts is a world that expected morning. That confidence, not the exact number at the top of the page, is the real clock dot, so let us set the kettle and let the dates drowse. If years were added, they sit there quietly like extra stitches on a scarf. If they weren't, the scarf still keeps out the draft. Either way, the night is long enough for a soft experiment. Breathe in for 4 rings of the bell. Breathe out for 4. Imagine the equinox sliding gently back to where the tables prefer it. And picture a monk in 837 drawing. A comet so exuberant it looks like a horse's tail. Somewhere a clerk considers whether today deserves a number at all, and decides to write fair with clouds, nothing unusual. That may be the truest entry in any chronicle. We can keep turning pages without looking for an ending, because endings are just dates in their best clothes. Let them hang on their pegs. We will be here a while, letting the seconds pool into minutes, then hours, then the kind of night that carries you kindly out beyond counting. You wouldn't think a calendar could develop a draft, as if time itself had a loose window frame, but that is the kind of gentle problem that likes to whisper at bedtime. We live by squares on a page and numbers that pretend to be sturdy, yet they were stitched together by people with ink stains and errands. A clerk in a cold room, a monk balancing moonlight with mathematics, a king who preferred round numbers the way bakers prefer round loaves, These are the sorts of tiny decisions that eventually tell you what day it is. If you're still awake, when we circle back to golden numbers and e-packs, you're welcome to subscribe, follow, or simply promise to remember where you put your birthday. But truly, please don't strain. Time never hurries. It's the only committee that always gets quorum. The classic calendar quarrel begins with Julius Caesar, who asked the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigines to make the year behave. The Julian fixed 365 days with a quarter day tucked neatly in two. Every year felt wonderfully symmetrical, the way a well-folded bedsheet feels like an accomplishment. Unfortunately, the Earth insisted on an extra 11 minutes and 14 seconds of annual personality. That is not much less than boiling an egg to soft instead of firm, but the air yawns as centuries pile up. By the 16th century, the spring equinox had wandered 10 days down the hallway. Lent arrived with the guilty air of a guest who misread the invitation. Festivals drifted. The tables used to compute Easter looked like the product of a very confident man with the wrong spectacles. So in 1582, the papal mathematicians took out the shears and trimmed. Thursday, October 4th, went to bed. Friday, October 15th, woke up. 10 numbers vanished from the calendar like spare. Buttons rolling under a dresser dot. This was the Gregorian solution in miniature. Leap years would happen on most century years, but not those divisible by 100 unless divisible by 400. It is an arithmetic sentence that reads like a polite threat, and it works almost perfectly. Catholic realms embraced it first, entering new dates as if stepping onto a newly scrubbed floor. Protestant countries, wary of papal mops, continued sliding shoes on the old wooden boards for a while. England didn't switch until 1752, deleting 11 days in one sweep and prompting the famous, possibly mythical complaint, "Give us our 11 days." In practice, people were mostly concerned with rent, wages, and fares. Bakers moved feast day buns. Law courts retuned their schedules. No one asked the sun for compensation. The sun, a patient landlord, continued its rounds without even sending a notice. And yet, somewhere between the business of days and the romance of numbers, a different suggestion settled in. Perhaps a block of the Middle Ages never happened. It is the kind of idea that feels like a warm blanket folded the wrong way, awkward but cozy. The story names an emperor, usually Otto III, a pope, and perhaps a Byzantine ally, who supposedly wanted the year 1000 with its satisfying row of zeros. To stand inside an important number rather than walk toward it, the story says they slid the calendar forward by nearly 300 years. It would have been a very administrative sort of magic trick. No dragons, only parchments, seals, and the improved swagger of a millennial year. One imagines the meeting minutes with admirable calm. Item: advance history to suit aesthetic preferences. Carried. There is something charmingly plausible about the mechanics. Dates, after all, are habits. If a ruler announces a year and scribes copy it and priests preach it and merchants stamp it on receipts for barrels of herring, the number acquires the comfortable weight of custom. Few villagers will challenge arithmetic written in a chancery hand when there are fields to weed and roofs to repair. And yes, the appeal of roundness is a human weakness. We stage centennials, not 93rd anniversaries. We applaud 222 on 2/22. With the pleased hush of a classroom when chalk squeaks interestingly, it does not strain the imagination to picture a monarch choosing to live inside a tidy number and recruiting the calendar to act as furniture. The theory strolls into its second room by pointing to what it calls the silent centuries, roughly 614 to 911, fewer inscriptions in stone, fewer bruising, bragging monuments, fewer sweeping court chronicles. The curtain of noise thins, and people mistake a hush for an absence. But if you lean in, you find cupboards full of small, Voices. Monasteries write about borrowing a cow and returning a cow but forgetting the calf. Abbeys trade vineyards and list the lengths of furrows as carefully as an artisan counting teeth on a comb. Royal charters allot mills with mill ponds and the geese that reside therein, a clause I would like to see revived for apartments with laundry rooms. Weather annals note when the Rhine froze, when hail resembled peas, or on an exciting year. Walnuts. Margins bloom with doodles. A bishop wearing a hat entirely unsuitable for gardening. A fish who looks like he's eavesdropping. An archer whose arrow refuses to go straight. These are not the gestures of a vacuum. Objects from the period also indulge in modesty. Wood rots. Many houses were built of it. Stone is recycled. Roman columns become thresholds for barns because a good threshold is always in demand. Parchment is expensive. A scribe with a sermon to copy will scrape a defunct sheep lawsuit off a page and write over it, producing a palimpsest whose ghost can sometimes be coaxed back with gentle light. Coins are melted and reborn as jewelry. Bells crack and become new bells with the old ones' names, a kind of metallurgical reincarnation. The physical record prefers the utilitarian. Sensible people reuse things, and the past loses a little noise every time a beam is planed smooth for a fresh roof. Imagine trying to reconstruct your teenage wardrobe after 10 years of giving perfectly. Good shirts to cousins. The Gap is not conspiracy. It is spring cleaning. Because the church relied on a workable calendar, it maintained one with the devotion of a librarian who can recite the Dewey Decimal System. Easter needed the moon, and the moon needed arithmetic that could be performed by a monk who had to supervise sheep in the afternoon. The computus, a set of tables and rules, marched into manuscripts as a kind of holy spreadsheet. Bede wrote about it with serene clarity. Margins collected golden numbers, a 19-year. Cycle whispering when full moons would sit politely near spring. The epoch the age of the moon on New Year's days served as a tidy bookmark, like the folded corner of a prayer card. In this environment, tinkering with dates wasn't part of a sinister grip. It was maintenance, like oiling a door. For those who cherish the idea of celestial edits, there are indeed notes on comets and eclipses to fuss over. Monks wrote, a sign appeared in the heavens like a torch, which we recognize as Halley's Comet strolling through 837, as if the sky had developed a soft fondness for pageantry. Chroniclers listed eclipses with the wonder of people describing a new recipe. At the third hour, the sun failed like a lamp, or the moon became the color of watered wine. Modern astronomers reverse engineer the heavens like careful bakers looking backward through a loaf, slice by slice. The matches between these events and conventional dates are surprisingly good. A phantom time director would have needed to coordinate. Thousands of observations across cultures and languages, leaving no smudges of disagreement. It would be the most successful multinational office project in history, which is a statement that sighs under its own weight. Skeptics also point to dendrochronology, tree rings that register each summer with a delicate groove in radiocarbon, samples that act as slow tickers inside wood, leather, and bones. The rings of an oak beam in a church roof do not know who is emperor. They only know sun and rain. When counted forward and backward and matched across regions, the rings become timelines that meet like well-lined seams. Greenland's ice cores add their own slips of paper, thin layers of volcanic ash, each a dated postcard from an eruption. These methods bicker sometimes, as siblings do, but together they put beamed ceilings and parchment scraps roughly where one would expect. If the ledger of years had been padded with nearly 300 ghost entries, the oaks would have tattled. Oaks love a tidy record. Still, it is soothing to wade into the hypothetical. Suppose someone announced tomorrow that we are, after careful recalibration, living in 1727. Your dog would keep excellent time without assistance. Tea would steep to the same strength. Your phone would update itself with the embarrassing eagerness of a footman trying to be modern. The hardest work would fall to tax offices and wedding planners. Eclipse chasers would add a column to their spreadsheets. Museums would host cheerful redating evenings with scones and a special exhibition of calendars we tried. One town would print tote bags. 1727 again, still open late. Human beings are wonderfully adaptable when the adaptation involves a printable poster. There's also the pleasure of following the historians who, without malice, tug politely at the tablecloth of time to see if anything wobbles. One points out that a ruler exists in lists without deeds, like a coat hook with no coats. Another notices that a script called Carolyn Minuscule appears early in one place and later in another, and wonders if it is due to copying, fashion, or a cataloging sneeze. Someone else cross-checks eclipses in Arabic, Chinese, and Latin sources, pleased when they rhyme and intrigued when they don't. Their footnotes accumulate like breadcrumb trails. See also frost in vineyards during the year of the eclipse. Compare with annals mentioning a comet described as brooms. Even when they end by reaffirming the old timeline, they leave lanterns along the path for other walkers who, like you, enjoy the soft crunch of inquiry underfoot. Along the margins of this whole business skitter the small delights that keep even. The drowsiest researcher awake for one more paragraph. A charter grants a mill with the water that pertains thereto. A phrase as tender as gifting a house with its morning sunbeams. A scribe marks an error by drawing a fish that looks embarrassed. The medieval equivalent of circling a typo with a smiley face. An English parish, translating the calendar reform into parish life, moves its annual goose fair but keeps the tradition of arguing about the weather in exactly the same spot by the church gate. In a ledger someone records half a chalice, which turned out to be a cup without a base, a notation of such hopeful precision that accountants everywhere should salute. These trivialities aren't proof of anything cosmic. They're just the kind of friendly static that lets the mind drift. And on the question of the church's supposed grip on time, it's worth picturing the daily mechanics. The Vatican issued bulls about calendars, yes, but the real work of timekeeping was done by people with bells and daylight to manage. Parish priests rang the Angelus when they could see the light at certain slants. Monks counted out the offices by breath and habit. If Matins started late because Brother Martin spilled ink, the cosmos didn't curdle. When Rome trimmed 10 days, parish clerks rewrote baptismal registers with sighs and extra lines, and midwives, who handled the truly urgent scheduling, continued to operate according to the needs of infants, naughty packs. Control is a strong word for a world run mostly on neighborly timing. By the end of any evening with phantom time, you tend to circle back to the same observation, the most persuasive evidence that the centuries were not conjured is not a majestic calculation or a papal decree, but the stubborn ordinariness of records. Grain tallies, rent agreements. Feasts moved because the river flooded. A complaint about a bridge toll written in a hand that makes everys look like a fishhook. There are so many Tuesdays, so many nothing unusual entries, so many. Little dramas of geese and hail and one late wagon. A conspiracy that large would have needed to fabricate boredom at scale. And that is the one thing even devoted schemers cannot bear to do. The universe saves its imagination for comments. People save theirs for anniversaries. So the calendar stays with its tiny creaks and kindly edits. Julius guessed well. Gregory adjusted better. Modern astronomers ran checks with stars that do not care who wears the crown. Perhaps an emperor once dreamed of a grander number under his feet. That is a tender human dream. Perhaps our centuries are exactly as padded as a sensible winter coat. Either way, the moon will put its silver thumbprint on the night according to laws older than all our ledgers, and a bell will count hours as if sorting buttons. If the equinox is a few hours here or there from where we wish it, the crocuses will ignore the memo, rising on cue from their own timetable, as they have patiently done through every reform, rumor, and missed appointment. And you can let the details soften like ink drying on vellum, confident that when you open your eyes tomorrow, there will be a date waiting, precise enough to meet the bus, vague enough to carry a nap. You might not expect a whole century to trip over a comma, but calendars are basically long sentences with very fussy punctuation. One extra dot, one missing pause, and spring arrives slightly out of breath. People in old robes notice this in their quiet way. The Julian calendar, set up in the 1st century BCE, with 365 days and a little quarterly cookie of extra time, felt crisp and rational, like fresh linen folded exactly to the corners. It was also wrong by a whisper, about 11 minutes and some seconds per year. The earth is persnickety that way. The error hid politely for a while, like a guest who doesn't want to trouble the host, and then, after centuries, began scooting the equinox along the hallway. Easter crept, saints' days drifted. Vineyards shrugged and kept their own schedule, as vineyards do. When Pope Gregory XIII finally brought out the ladder and fixed the squeaky hinge in 1582, he instructed the world to jump from October 4th to October 15th, which sounds dramatic until you realize it is the administrative version of sweeping crumbs off a tablecloth. If you're still awake by the time we get to something called the E-Pact, you're welcome to subscribe or simply promise. Your pillow, you'll think about it tomorrow. The moon will not be offended either way. The Julian and Gregorian difference is the sort of math that makes you nod slowly and then buy bread. Julian rules are simple. Every 4th year, add a day. Gregorian rules are like the sign on a museum door, open most days except when it is not. Century years are not leap years, except when divisible by 400. Thus, 1700, 1800, and 1900 had no extra day, while 2000 did, behaving like an earnest student who double-checked the homework. This keeps the calendar in a dignified waltz with the sun. The reform rolled out unevenly because time, ironically, takes time to change. Spain and Italy switched at once. Protestant realms hesitated. England waited until 1752 and then leapt 11 days forward in a single tidy shuffle. Sweden attempted a gradual approach and accidentally created February 30th in 1712, which remains my favorite evidence that bureaucracy is just a form of creative writing. Accounts were recalculated, rents recalibrated, birthdays rescheduled with good humor. The sun kept its own counsel. From here, the mind drifts toward the proposition that a chunk of history, the prize sample is nearly 3 centuries, was not lived at all but declared. The tale assigns agency to Emperor Otto III and a few clerical colleagues, who allegedly preferred a round number on their stationery and adjusted the odometer of time. It is such an elegantly boring motive that one almost admires it. There is no villainy, only aesthetic preference and an affection for the year 1000, which does look handsome when written in neat numerals across a charter. One imagines a committee meeting with damp wax seals and a good fire. Someone mentions the inconvenience of moving the date. Someone else points out the advantage of immediate millennial prestige, coins, speeches, a commemorative goblet. A clerk in the corner begins drafting the circular. By common consent, we have advanced history. It is the sort of sentence that makes a hallway of monks stop on the same step. Evidence for the emperor's trick is like a shy cat, most convincing when left to come out on its own. Advocates observe gaps, fewer big buildings, fewer self-congratulatory chronicles, fewer sneering statues in the 7th to early 10th. Centuries. Silence, they argue, announces absence. Yet the farther you read into the paperwork of small lives, the more occupied the void becomes. People buy mills and sell them again. Abbeys swap parcels of land with hedgerows as the brook divides, which is the most patient kind of border. Shipments of salt are recorded in tidy lines because salt insists on accounting. In the margins of sermons, novice monks sketch animals that would not survive in nature, a rabbit with medieval moral clarity, a fish who looks like your neighbor when he doesn't agree but remains polite. Charters mutter about the right to collect river tolls at a bend notable for geese that refuse to relocate. None of this is spectacular. All of it is the dull gold of ordinary time. The centuries in question also specialized in recycling. Stone from ruined Roman baths became thresholds because the foot licks old marble. Wooden houses turned into other wooden houses, which, given what wood does in weather, makes archaeologists sigh. Parchment was expensive. A sermon could be scraped off an older legal quarrel, leaving a palimpsest in which the ghost of a goat dispute quietly glows under the gospel of the day. When objects get reused, timelines lose their loud, confident edges and soften into practical gradients. It feels like absence because we tend to keep the monuments and misplace the mundane. It is difficult to prove the continuity of Tuesdays unless someone saved all the shopping lists, which, regrettably, no one did. The church, accused in some tellings of guiding the hour hand with a firm clerical thumb, mostly wanted Easter to land properly and the feast to avoid stepping on each other. This required the computus, a collection of rules and tables that read like a very devout spreadsheet. The moon, which does not take meetings, had to be predicted with cycles the 19-year Metonic cycle, the golden numbers sprinkled like breadcrumbs on medieval calendars, and the epact, which is simply the age of the moon on New Year's Day, but sounds like a password to a door in an abbey wall. Bede explained much of this with admirable clarity, adding just enough Latin to make you sit up straighter. Parish priests learned enough to get through the year, then forgot some, relearned it, and passed it to the next priest with annotations like begin ringing slightly earlier if the hill hides the sunrise. Control of time looked less like a conspiracy and more like the daily life of bells, faithful, local, and subject to a neighbor telling you the peal sounded lovely but a touch long. Astronomy is the dreamy part of the argument. Eclipses were noticed, comets recorded as fiery, brooms, and unusual nights set down with the calm moral tone of weather reports. Modern computers can rewind the sky and say, with the unruffled authority of a librarian sliding a book into place, that an eclipse should have swept across a certain latitude on a certain date. Many medieval notes line up well with those predictions. Some do not, which makes evenings for scholars in sweater vests pass very pleasantly. You can lose hours comparing a Chinese account of a red moon with a Latin mention of a strange darkness after supper. The idea that monks falsified celestial omens for hundreds of years across continents presumes an international coordination that even modern airports cannot achieve. Still, it is a harmless sport to imagine a clandestine monastic hotline. Brother, remember to add the comment, which brightness? Moderate, like jam. There are also the trees and the ice, neither of which care whether humans count cleverly. Tree rings track sunny years and sulky ones. Ice cores carry thin lines of volcanic ash, similar to the way a notebook accumulates smudges from lunches. Eaten near it, dendrochronologists can say, with the humility of people who spend time with patient objects, that a beam cut for a roof in Bavaria fits neatly into a sequence extending across continents. Radiocarbon ratios tap their little fingers and agree or disagree in measurable ways. These are faint voices, but consistent ones. If centuries of phantom time were imported like contraband, the oaks would have registered the delay. Oaks are meticulous witnesses, especially about rain. Meanwhile, the phantom years keep making good bedtime conversation because they offer a thought experiment. What would change tomorrow morning if it were announced that you had all been living in 1727 by mistake? Your grandmother's recipes would remain unperturbed. Your dog would still arrive at the door at the exact minute the walk should begin, a creature of cosmic precision. Most inconveniences would inflate gently in the offices of tax authorities, whose calendars are already mysterious to the layperson. There would be a wave of tasteful reprinting, business cards, diplomas, a very long list of meeting minutes now. Slightly embarrassed, a museum would host an evening with 1727, offering ale in replica mugs and selling postcards that read, "We were right on time, just differently." The rest of us would continue rinsing dishes and charging phones as if nothing had happened, which in a sense it hadn't. Historians who question the neatness of the standard timeline are not villains. They are the people at the picnic who peer at the map and ask if the walking path actually goes through the pond. It is useful to have one or two such friends. They point out documentary clusters that look suspiciously curated, reigns of kings that wobble at the edges, and manuscripts whose handwriting seems to belong to a century it shouldn't have met yet. Then patiently, and often with notes that would make graph paper blush, other scholars add context. The scribes traveled. That ink came from a different trade network. This monastery had a habit of copying old texts in modern script because it was proud of legibility. The conversation moves items between shelves, which is almost the entire job of history. Some evenings, it is fun to imagine a smoking down a parchment that says, "Year advanced by request of His Majesty for ceremonial dignity." But in the long run, the shelves themselves are the evidence. There are too many little boring things resting on them. Even the alleged celestial edits in manuscripts tend to feel like housekeeping. A scribe who discovers an older, eclipsed table that doesn't fit the new reform will cross out a line and write a better number in the margin. He might add a helpful finger pointing at it, a manicule, which is the medieval equivalent of highlighting in a cheerful color. When the reform of 1582 deleted days, parish registers in southern Germany sprouted notes like "baptized on the 18th, which comes after the 4th this year. Do not worry. The calmness of those sentences ought to be a civic monument. It is difficult to sustain suspicions of grand manipulation while someone is patiently explaining how they kept track of babies during a calendrical haircut. And yet, for those who like a free song, the margins are full of tiny mysteries. A doodled star with an extra ray, a note that a bell cracked during the darkness at supper. These are perfect for tucking under your pillow when the mind tires. Of evidence, it wanders toward metaphors. Calendars are like cupboards in which households keep mismatched mugs. Every generation adds one with a different handle. The Julian mug is sturdy but heavy. The Gregorian mug fits the hand a little better. Somewhere on the top shelf is a commemorative cup for the year 1000 with a chip no one mentions. None of this changes the tea. The tea is the rotation of the earth and the trip of our globe around the sun and the friendly moon practicing its phases as if for a recital. Tea does not read the label on the mug. If you prefer coffee for this analogy, the cosmos will accommodate you. What remains, after all the patient cross-checking, is the comfort of routine. Documents list geese by the dozen and fish by the hundredweight, and occasionally someone miscounts and then apologizes 3 pages later. Villages announce fairs in lines that look like laundry lists dressed in Latin. Bread, ale, ribbons, and one available field for dancing, if not too wet. A charter grants rights to gather deadwood without breaking living branches, which might be the most sensible law ever written. The people who recorded these things were not staging a centuries-long performance. They were running errands under weather. The boredom is persuasive. To fabricate it would require a conspiracy capable of inventing thousands of dull Tuesdays with consistent mistakes. No one loves dullness that much. Not even historians dot, and so the phantom time hypothesis settles where many bedtime thoughts finally settle, as a gentle possibility folded back into the drawer. It is too lovely to throw out, too impractical to wear. The calendars we use are good enough for train schedules and birthdays, and reminding us when pears will be ripe. The comets will perform on their own timetable regardless. If we are out by a day, the crocuses forgive us. If we are off by a century, the oaks have already adjusted. You can let the arguments blur into a comfortable hum, like a clock in the next room that you stop hearing until you listen. There will be another morning soon. It will have a date in the corner that works reasonably well. A church bell will count the hour, slightly slow or slightly fast, and someone will correct it at a sensible time. The sky will present its ordinary miracle with quiet precision, and we will meet it with our lists, our leases, our golden numbers, our naps. You might not expect a calendar to squeak, but time has always been a doorway with a slightly stubborn hinge. Open it too often, and the frame shifts a little. Ignore it for centuries, and one day the sun shows up for spring while your calendar is still wearing winter boots. This is, in a very sleepy nutshell, what the world discovered about the Julian calendar study, sensible and wrong by the size of a coffee break each year. 11 minutes and seconds, nothing dramatic, only the sort of delay that makes you miss the beginning of a sermon but still catch the hymn. Those minutes added up like dust under a cupboard, so that by the 16th century, Easter floated away from the equinox like a drift of pollen. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII performed the most famous housekeeping in history, sweeping 10 days off the floor and quietly changing the rules of leap years. Some places nodded and did it at once. Others stalled, as nations do when the form requires 3 signatures. If you're still awake by the time I explain the Epacta, word that sounds like a secret society but is mostly about the moon's age, on New Year's Day feel free to subscribe, or simply promise yourself you will remember that word in the morning. The moon will keep it in mind for you. The clash between the Julian and Gregorian systems is really a quarrel about how to count almost. Julius Caesar's calendar assumed a neat 365.25 days, which is wonderfully tidy but slightly off. The Earth prefers 365.2422 days, as if it enjoys the mysterious decimals of a cafe receipt. Gregory's reform did not scold Julius. It corrected him with the politeness of a librarian quietly reshelving a popular book. Century years would no longer be leap years unless divisible by 400. Thus 1700, 1800, and 1900 did not receive extra days, while the year 2000 did, striding through the station like a traveler whose ticket has been checked twice. Implementation, of course, proceeded in the unhurried way of a cow ambling through a gate. Catholic realms stepped first. Protestant ones peered over the fence and walked later. England waited until 1752 and then, with administrative calm, went to bed on September 2nd and woke on September 14th. Some people are said to have shouted, "Give us back our 11 days." But in the fine print of diaries, what you see is account books calmly skipping lines, rents prorated with tight handwriting, and one vicar noting that Mrs. Carter insisted on celebrating her birthday on the old style for reasons. Sweden tried a gradual change and accidentally created February 30th, 1712, which remains the calendar's only moment of whimsy, like a button sewn in the wrong place that everyone decided suited the coat. From this tidy preface, the story swivels into rumor as softly as a chair turning toward the fire. The phantom time hypothesis suggests that nearly 3 centuries, roughly 614 to 911, were not lived at all, but were stapled into chronology by ambitious hands. The blame is usually placed on Emperor Otto III, whose taste for grand gestures might have included pushing the odometer of time forward to bask in the prestige of the year 1000. It is an oddly bureaucratic conspiracy with no car traces, just memos. One imagines Otto holding a meeting about the branding advantages of being a millennial ruler, what it would do for coins, charters, and morale. A clerk who had sharpened ink-stained quills for years would have nodded thoughtfully and suggested a commemorative font. It's a theory that raises an eyebrow and then politely invites you to look at the shelves. Those shelves' archives really contain the so-called silent centuries. The 7th, 8th, and early 9th seem at a distance to whisper rather than speak. Fewer monumental buildings, fewer ambitious chronicles, fewer very serious men with very pointed shoes writing down their own importance. If you stand back and squint, the gap looks like a missing tooth in the smile of history. But move closer and you notice the kind of paperwork that never vanishes unless a people stop eating or arguing. Little charters survive like pressed leaves. A village in Bavaria grants rights to collect deadwood in the forest without breaking living branches, which might be the most practical sentence ever written. An abbey records that a neighbor who borrowed a millstone did not return it, and the tone is as enduringly tired as any modern email. A monk copies a sermon onto scraped parchment that once contained a lawsuit about a goat. Under the holy text, if you tilt the page to the window, you can just make out the earlier goat, stubborn as ever. Silence, it turns out, is full of murmurs. When you listen next to the window, artifacts feel scarce in those years, partly because medieval Europe was a specialist in reusing things. Stones from Roman baths became thresholds. Beams were lifted from crumbling halls to roof workaday barns. A gilded clasp might be reattached to a new book and then to another, until it finally retired in a drawer with nothing to do but remember. Wood rots, cloth frays, parchment gets scraped. The things that survive are either monumental, blessed, accidentally frozen, or lucky. Everyday beauty dissolves into weather. Archaeologists know this and sigh into their tea. They also know that people who constantly repair, repurpose, and rebury are, in fact, very much there. To erase 3 centuries, you must erase the habit of making do. That habit is the most indestructible artifact of all. Now the story leans toward churches, which were not simply buildings, but a network of clocks made of bells. Time and Christian. Europe was pinned to Easter, and Easter is pinned to the moon, which, as every parent knows, cannot be pinned at all. Calculating the proper day is called the computus, a word that sounds heavy but is really just a bundle of gentle tables, rules, and reminders like a recipe annotated by several careful ants. There's the 19-year metonic cycle, at the end of which the phases of the moon recur on the same days. The golden number, which is your place in that cycle, and the epact, the moon's age on January 1st, a small integer that looks up at you from the page like a child raising a hand. Saints such as Bede wrote explanations that could escort a parish priest through the seasons without losing him in the footnotes. On the local level, it was not power, but housekeeping. Keep the fasts aligned with the light. Keep the fairs spaced so the geese can molt in peace. Keep the bells from ringing each other into a quarrel. Imagining the Vatican as a lever that shifts. Centuries under its weight is exciting. Watching a deacon add a note, ring slightly earlier if the hill hides the sunrise, is truer. Large institutions often appear to be steering the ship when in fact they're sewing new sails and hoping for steady wind. This is not to say the churchmen lacked ambition. They liked tidy patterns and the prestige of good tables. But the evidence of villages shows a timekeeping system that behaved like sourdough, centrally taught, locally fed. A computus from Ireland migrates in the pocket of a traveler and settles in a monastery in the Alps, where someone copies it in a hand we can recognize as cheerful. adding a doodle of the moon with a face that appears to be slightly skeptical. When the Gregorian reform arrived, scribes calmly amended their calendars, sometimes striking through a line with a delicate flourish and adding in the margin, "Use this table now." Father Hugh prefers it. Conspiracy tends to look like fiction. These margins look like laundry lists. Astronomy is the favored ground for those who suspect edits. If a chronicle notes a solar eclipse on a certain afternoon, and modern calculations insist the sky should have been clear, theories unroll like carpets. The alignment could be off, the date is wrong. The recorder wrote after the fact. Some entries are indeed unruly. A fiery broom was seen in the north, which is a poetic comment, and poetry is difficult to match to ephemerides, yet many. Medieval observations synchronize neatly with the predictable behavior of the heavens. East Asian records log a lunar eclipse on a night when a Mediterranean scribe also remarks, "The moon was eaten at supper," which is a phrase so domestic. You can almost hear the spoons. It is possible to imagine a secret room in which learned men edited centuries, recalculating the sky and inserting events with extraordinary restraint. It is easier to imagine people writing down what they saw, and once in a while describing a halo with too much enthusiasm because halos are impressive and the scribe had the good pinot. Outside the vellum, the world keeps its own ledger. Tree rings respond to drought and flood with the stubborn honesty of wood. Oak beams taken from churches yield annual stripes that can be matched, like barcodes, to master chronologies built timber by timber. Volcanic eruptions deposit thin lines of ash and polar ice. Radiocarbon counts down its half-lives with the patience of someone who knits on trains. When you align the paperwork of people with the paperwork of trees and ice, the columns add agreeably. The so-called silent centuries contain ordinary weather, a dry string of summers, a gloomy patch, something that could have been a far-off volcano. To smuggle in 297 phantom years, you would have to convince the oaks to grow rings for seasons. That never happened. The oaks are, I regret to inform you, not easily persuaded. But let us lean into the thought experiment because it is a good pillow. Suppose we woke tomorrow to a polite announcement that, after thorough review, it turns out we have been living in 1727 all along. Your kettle, being an empiricist, would still boil at the same degree. Birds would continue their very successful policy of ignoring calendars and working from temperature and light. Tax offices would sigh in many languages and prepare a form. Somewhere, a small museum would plan a tasteful exhibit titled Recalibrating the Present, featuring a long wall of dates shuffled 3 feet to the left. People would buy commemorative tote bags because they always do. The rest of us would adjust our birthdays by an agreeable amount and continue the serious business of doing laundry. Nothing essential would change, which is part of the charm and perhaps also the point. The scholars who entertain the hypothesis are not mischief makers so much as cartographers of doubt. They look for wrinkles in the fabric, mismatched handwriting, a dynasty that seems compressed, a stray piece of pottery, and a layer where the pottery should not be. They ask why an emperor's reign overlaps a saint's life in one source, but not another. They wonder why a chronicle jumps from one year to a later year with the textual equivalent of a shrub. These questions are good housekeeping. Dust finds its way into any room. The replies, painstaking and sometimes endearingly fussy, tend to explain the wrinkles with travel, copying habits, regional dating quirks, or a scribe who thought the year began in March, as many did, and forgot to mention it. The conversation is slow and precise, like two people folding a very large sheet. Because this is a bedtime program, the micro details are the best lullabies. The word manicule for the little pointing hand in the margins. The golden number is shining. Not at all, but marching across calendars like well-behaved buttons. The practice of writing Easter tables on board and hanging them near the door so even a hurried sacristan could check them. The note in a parish register that says, baptized on the 18th, which this year follows the 4th. Do not be alarmed. The corner where a monk has drawn a rabbit that looks deeply suspicious of the entire enterprise of chronology. You are, at this moment, less awake than you were, and the rabbit is doing its job. Now the script slides toward the last of our 4. Soft rooms, the present, which is always the oddest century. There are modern historians who dare to question time in the sense that they ask the ultimate boring but brave question: how do we know that we know this? They count how many independent witnesses we have for an event, not because they mistrust anyone witness, but because counting is comforting. They compare the radiocarbon date of a burial plank with the ring pattern of the tree it came from, the style of the nails, the place name on a nearby boundary stone. They run computer models that align medieval records of eclipses with celestial mechanics, then hum approvingly when the graphs behave. They are gentle people who argue for several pages about the correct translation of after supper, meaning after sunset or after the evening prayer, and how that affects the minute hand on a sky chart. They are not trying to be right so much as trying not to be wrong, which is a good motto for any century dot. And finally, the thought that bends like a reed and then decides to keep swaying. What if it's all a lie? Not a mean lie, just a cozy story the species told itself to flatten a bumpy road. The answer, if there is one, is that our lives are filled with useful fictions, money, maps, polite smiles, and yet we function. A calendar is one of those fictions. That is true because it works. It gets the crops sown, the ships launched, the saints honored, the taxes collected, the holidays arranged, the pears picked precisely when pear picking is a joy. If the scaffolding is off by a day, or even by a shuddering century, the pears are still sweet. The sun keeps exactly the appointments we cannot keep for it. The moon, unconsulted, rehearses her phases in gracious order and accepts no revisions. So the phantom time hypothesis ends where the best bedtime notions end. Tucked in, unproven, harmless, and a little smiling. There may be a missing empire. There may be artifacts that never were. There may be celestial edits and Vatican grips that amount, up close to careful people keeping handsome tables by candlelight. There may even be, somewhere in an archive, a joking marginal note about the year being nudged for ceremonial convenience. If someone finds it, they will write a paper with a title that begins strongly and ends with a question mark. We will read it, nod, and decide that it changes nothing at breakfast. The kettle sings on time. The clock in the hallway is slightly fast, as it has always been. You could get up to correct it, or you could let it lead by that tiny scouts. Step a minute into a future we count as best we can. Either way, the night is long enough, and the calendars are doing their wonderful, boring job. Close your eyes. If we have lost or gained 300 years, they will still be exactly where we left them in the morning. You might not expect a year to wobble, but it does just a little, like a table with one short leg tucked under a linen cloth. The old Julian calendar did its best to pretend the leg was fine. It gave the world 365 days and a neat quarter, which is excellent for arithmetic and slightly poor for astronomy. The Earth, being uncooperative, insists on 365 days. 5 hours, 48 minutes, and a handful of seconds that behave like breadcrumbs. Those crumbs piled up across centuries until spring drifted away from its assigned seat. Easter wandered with it, and Bishop sighed the long sigh of people who have to reprint schedules. If you're still awake by the time we reach the epact, which sounds like a wizard but is mainly the moon's age on New Year's Day, feel delightfully free to subscribe. Or rest your eyes and let the moon keep track of itself. It usually does. Gregory XIII tidied the wobble in 1582 in a way that remains the Platonic ideal of administrative bedtime stories. He crossed out 10 October days, whispered a new leap year, rule, and then went to dinner. Century years would no longer be leap years unless they were divisible by 400. Thus 1600 kept its extra day, 1700 did not, 1800 did not, 1900 did not, and the pleasantly round year 2000 strutted in on the 29th of February like a guest wearing a very correct cap. Adoption, of course, was leisurely. Catholic realms stepped first, Protestant ones made agreeable faces and waited, and the Orthodox world waved cheerfully and said, "We'll get to it." England slept through 1751, woke in 1752, and skipped 11 days with the resigned calm of a clerk losing a page in a ledger. Some pamphleteers grumbled, but most people simply continued their routines with the bizarre energy of humans. Who can miss 11 days and still remember to put beans to soak? Sweden tried to glide from one calendar to the other and accidentally produced a 30th of February in 1712, a day that existed precisely long enough for everyone to write February 30th, once and then never again. Russia moved in 1918. 2 revolutions and a calendar reform made for a busy to-do list. In each place, markets opened, geese honked, and bakers kept baking. Time bent slightly, and bread rose. Regardless, into this practical housekeeping wanders the soft rumor that makes comfortable chairs creak. The phantom time hypothesis suggests we are living with approximately 297 years stapled into the historical. Scrapbook by ambitious minds, often blamed on the court of Otto III. The story is so bureaucratic that it becomes soothing. No swords, only pens. Imagine a palace office at dusk. Someone observes that it would be splendid to reign during the sacred year, 1000. Another replies that the number is a prestige vehicle, very modern, very sleek, and would do wonders for imperial branding. A monk brings in a tray with bread and cheese. Quills are sharpened. Over several unhurried evenings, the odometer of history is rolled forward with the quiet determination usually reserved for copying hymnals. It is a bedtime conspiracy, mild, papery, and strangely polite. The trouble is that the centuries from 614 to 911 are not empty. So much is faintly lit. They are the library stacks during evening hours when the motion sensors take a moment to wake the lights. If you browse without hurry, you find legal scraps, farm sales, prayer lists, a charter about the rights to collect fallen branches without breaking living wood, which is the ancient equivalent of take only what is already on the ground. An abbey notes that a millstone has gone missing and adds, with a patience that suggests long experience, that the borrower is known to the brothers. A woman in a small town gives a vineyard to her niece, with the boundary described as from the willow by the ditch to the stone shaped like a sleeping pig, an extremely useful landmark if you know the pig. A monk copies a sermon onto parchment that previously carried a contract about an ox, the older writing showing through faintly like a daydream beneath the holy text. These are not trumpet blasts of empire. They are murmurs of maintenance. If 3 centuries were invented, someone also invented the small, worm boredom of collecting deadwood and labeling sleeping pig stones, and that is a level of dedication to fiction most novelists would envy. Artifacts that never were turned out upon inspection to be artifacts that never wanted to last. Wood returns to soil, cloth becomes dust. Ink flakes from reused pages. Buildings get recycled into other buildings with great practical cheer. A Roman threshold becomes a church step. A column becomes a trough. A bronze clasp holds one generation's book and then another's. Everyday loveliness rarely survives unless it is accidentally buried or stubbornly useless. Archaeologists have cabinets of buckles because buckles refuse to stop being buckles. They have fewer shirts because shirts, when done, become nothing. The absence of shirts does not prove the absence of people. It proves that someone mended the shirt until it became rag, and then used the rag to polish the buckle, which we still have. In that light, the 7th and 8th centuries are stocked with precisely the kinds of things that outlast habits. Coins, buckles, pits, post holes, those millstone complaints, and the bones of dinners. The church is said to have a grip on time, which sounds dramatic until you watch how the grip works. Christian timekeeping in the medieval West was a tangle of bells, moon tables, and local habits. Easter, that migratory feast, is calculated through the computus, a word with the dignity of a courthouse but the temperament of a kitchen notebook. There's the 19-year Metonic cycle, after which the phases of the moon land on the same calendar days. The golden number, a glittering name for a small integer, and the epact, which knows how old the moon is on the 1st of January, and behaves like a helpful child counting on fingers. Monks wrote guides with the tone of cousins explaining a complicated board game. Bede did it, naturally, with a gentle voice that survives, even when translated by people who really like footnotes. A scriptorium would keep a wooden Easter table, hanging by the door, so the sacristan could glance up while carrying candles and say, "Aha, the 14th moon hits here." It was power in the way that bread recipes are power. Whoever controls the starter controls the rolls. Celestial edits sound like someone with a celestial pencil quietly moving the moon. In reality, scribes recorded meteors as fiery brooms, comets as hairy stars, eclipses as instances when the sun seemed bitten. An eclipse noticed in the Mediterranean is often matched by a Chinese or Korean record for the same night. A coincidental harmony that is hard to fake unless every court on Earth is secretly sharing stationery. The heavens are tidy but unforgiving. They are difficult to retrofit. If a chronicle says a red-tailed broom was seen in the north for 3 nights, astronomers can sometimes point to a known comet swishing through its path like a polite janitor. When observations misalign, the cause is usually more human than cosmic. A scribe copying in poor light, a local habit of beginning the year in March and neglecting to mention it, or a monk who counted vigils as days. One suspects he had not slept well. The idea of a room in Rome where centuries are quietly redistributed like budgets is delicious, but it conflicts with the picture of 1,000 parish churches ringing slightly off from one another, each sure of its own sunrise. The people who question all this are not villains in long cloaks. They are the world's gentlest auditors. They check whether a timber in a roof has tree rings that agree with the ring patterns of other timbers from the same region. They take a crumb of parchment and ask the carbon inside whether it is as old as the ink above it pretends to be. They compare a reported eclipse to the stargazer's mathematics and hum satisfactorily when the shadow falls where the text puts it. They argue with exquisite courtesy about whether after supper indicates a time before Compline or simply after somebody had the good sense to sit down with bread and stew. The debates move at the speed of academic seasons, slowly, in circles, with a harvest of footnotes every few years. Most conclude that the timeline is not perfect in punctuation, but serviceable in prose dot, and if the bold proposal were right, if Otto and his friends had indeed blown up a balloon of 3 centuries and tied it to the roof of history, would anything in the kitchen change? The kettle would still boil at 100 degrees Celsius, which is a kind of stubborn honesty. Birds would continue to schedule migration by the style known as outside. Accountants would nod, reshuffle columns, and produce a new version of page 2 for all. Forms beginning within museums would hold a charming exhibition titled "The Years We Never Had." featuring a long white wall where children could measure themselves against the absent centuries and declare they're taller than 735. Someone would print tea towels listing the revised sequence of kings. The world would be briefly delighted, and buses would continue to arrive at 9:13. Except when they didn't, even if the missing empire were a mirage, the longing for neat numbers is real. Humans hug round years because they feel finished. We like 1000 and 2000 for the same reason we like cakes that come frosted. The hypothesis speaks to that affection, to the sense that history ought to arrive in boxes that stack nicely. But history usually shows up in bags that crinkle, with a receipt you can't quite read. Conspiracy is the dream that there's a manager in the back room. The record often reveals a small town committee and a very long agenda. That is either disappointing or very comforting. Tonight, for purposes of sleep, let it be comforting. So we come to the part where we remember again that time is not just counted, it is kept. The Vatican's great role was not so much to twist the clock as to remind everyone to wind it. The Gregorian reform was the kind of memo that brings meetings back to the same page. Parishes adjusted, markets adjusted, household calendars were corrected with a sigh, and a dozen little customs survived the entire maneuver without blinking. A village might keep celebrating a saint by the old style, because the fair fitted better in the shearing season. If the Vatican held a grip, it looked like a grandmother's hand guiding a child across a busy street, firm, practical, and concerned mostly with not ending up under a horse. The celestial edits, if there were any, were always compromises between perfect sky and human convenience. Bells ring before dawn, not because anyone enjoys being cold, but because work waits. Candlemas comes when candles are wanted. Harvest festivals follow the harvest, not the verse. Weather pushes feast days more frequently than popes do. A chronicle may solemnly declare that such and such occurs on the 15th day. The margin will later add, move to the 16th on account of rain, which is the truest power in the book. In this sleepy, wide-angle view, timekeeping turns out to be a community garden. People weed it according to their backs and show up with baskets. The plots are uneven. The tomatoes are excellent, still living in 1727. Is the sort of question you can ask only late at night, when the appliances are humming and you have a little leisure to imagine a world that got its sums wrong and functioned beautifully anyway. If we were, we would not be surprised. The coffee would taste the same. Letters would find their way because addresses are not eras. We would move the bookmark and continue. Historians would release an updated syllabus. Comedians would make jokes about retroactive age changes, and someone would immediately calculate how many pseudo-years their sourdough starter has lived. Most of us would quietly rejoice that taxes due on or before the 15th had accidentally been due on or before the 4th 11 days earlier several centuries ago, and therefore no longer our problem. The people who dare to question time are finally unusually good companions for sleeplessness. They sit with maps, scripts, cores of ice, and beams of oak. They compare, they mutter, they nod. They are not seeking the dramatic unmasking of history, but the gentle reassurance that the ledger balances more or less. When it does not, they pin a note, apologize for the smudge, and look again. From their care, we learn that the past is porous but not jelly. It stands well enough to hold our cups. Each new method dendrochronology with its wooden barcodes, radiocarbon humming down its half-lives, eclipse calculations with their geometry that looks like embroidery adds a stitch. The fabric may never be seamless. It is certainly warm, and if it's all a lie, a kindly one woven to make the journey feel smoother, then perhaps the lie is simply that time is a straight road with mile markers. The day keeps reminding us it is more like a roundabout with good signage. Sun, moon, seasons, rent day, birthdays, anniversaries that shift with human convenience, all of it turning. An emperor might have wanted to stand at the marker 1000 and pose for a coin. He would still have had to decide when to plant beans. You too have beans and a kettle and a clock that is slightly fast on purpose because you tell yourself it helps. There may be phantom years, or there may be only ordinary ones, wearing different hats in different towns. Either way, when you turn out the lamp, the hinge of the night works perfectly, swinging you into a quiet where nothing asks to be proved, and the only remaining task is wonderfully boring. Breathe in, breathe out, and let the calendar, whichever one you like, keep. Watch at the foot of the bed. Check till you soar. You might not expect a librarian to argue with a century, but they do very politely, in the tone used for reminding someone about a late book. They push their glasses up, reach for a pencil, and say, "I'm not sure the year 741 belongs where you've put it." Then they show you a tree. Trees keep diaries and rings the way we keep photos in our phones, except the trees are less dramatic and much more consistent. Each year, a ring. Wet years, a little whiter. Dry years, a little spare. If you line up enough oaks, each with a memory of sunlight and rain, you can join their rings into a long wooden zipper called a chronology. In some regions, the zipper runs straight through the Middle Ages with only a hiccup or two, like stitching on a quilt your great dash, great dash, great dash, great dash grandparents forgot to finish and someone eventually did. When the phantom time claim stands up and clears its throat, someone in a sweater just gestures at the timber in a church roof and says, "The tree that became this beam died in the year you proposed didn't happen." The beam does not respond. It carries the roof the way it always has. If you're still awake by the time we reach the calibration curve, which sounds like a roller coaster designed by a statistician, feel unhurriedly free to subscribe. Don't, I'll be here, whispering to lumber. The wooden auditors have a favorite trick called wiggle matching, which is a term that makes everyone inexplicably happy. The idea is simple. Radiocarbon dating gives you a rough window for when the trees stop drinking the atmosphere. The rings give you a pattern of fat and thin years unique to a place and a time. Slide the ring pattern along the master timeline until the wiggles line up, and there you are. A year so specific it can make a coin feel insecure. The method has been used to place Viking ships, abandoned wells, and beams in German halls that still smell faintly, if you put your nose to them, of the forest they came from. One laboratory notes each sample with a name like Oak Nave South Truss, which is functionally poetic. There's something comfortable about the calm certainty of wood saying, "I grew here then, I darkened, I held. And by the way, that rainy summer you forgot was in 703. It is a very modest sort of time travel. There are no capes. There's a clipboard. Radiocarbon is the second quiet rebel in this story, working night shifts in small laboratories where everything hums. Living things collect carbon as if it were gossip, a little fresh each day, including a tiny portion that is unstable and slowly forgets itself according to a half-life. When the thing dies, the intake stops and the forgetting continues, and a technician in a lab coat can measure how many whispers remain. The machine, which looks like an espresso maker that went to graduate school, returns numbers that mean sometime around the century, because the amount of unstable carbon in the air has wobbled over millennia, the sky being as indecisive as anyone else. To straighten that wobble, scholars built calibration curves using those very same tree rings, along with varved lake mud annual layers, stacked like thin pancakes and corals that wrote down sea chemistry without worrying who would read it. When the numbers and the rings and the mud nod at each other, the date narrows. A beam becomes not any old medieval beam, but that beam from that winter when frost broke clay pots on the abbey shelf. In the margins of published papers, you sometimes find the phrase unconcordant results, which is technical for we asked 3 different witnesses and they told the same story. The calibration curves have names like IntCal, which sounds like a gentle superhero, and they get updated every so often when a new set of trees decides to come forward and testify. Each update is an exercise in apologizing to the past with uncommon grace. Scholars publish a new curve and say, "We're terribly sorry. Your date moves by about 30 years to the left." The objects take this well. Coins do not file complaints. Beams maintain their roofs with serene equanimity. If a burial moves from late 7th century to early 8th, the person interred does not object. The living adjust their footnotes and make tea. Somewhere a graduate student celebrates by buying a pastry. In this way, time is questioned, and then it quietly answers. And then everyone goes back to the pastry, while the wood and carbon work through chemistry. The astronomers do their detective work with shadows. Eclipses are clocks that leave fingerprints. If a chronicle says the sun was bitten at the 3rd hour on a spring day, you can ask the sky whether it was in a biting mood over that town in those decades. We have careful eclipse calculation stretching back far beyond any imperial memo, based on the same celestial mechanics that tell your phone where to put the moon emoji. Chinese, Korean, and Arabic courts kept meticulous records of dragons eating the sun. Babylonian scribes made clay tablets with the moon's manners inscribed across them, and Mediterranean monks did their best to notice the sky between. Chores. When an eclipse in a Frankish annal matches an eclipse in an East Asian record, and both fit the modern calculation to the day, the effect is soothing, like finding the original lid for a very old jar. Could every observatory on Earth have conspired to misstate celestial events for 3 centuries? That would require a level of coordination never achieved by humans outside of opening night for a school play. And even then there is always one shepherd who forgets his line.comets help, as they always have, by arriving late to parties and being impossible to ignore. A Harry star shows up. Everyone writes with varying levels of alarm. The date gets fixed whether or not anyone meant to fix it. In 1 year, a monk writes, "A broom star in the north." A court astrologer hundreds of leagues away writes, "A star with a tail in the west." The modern orbit says, "Yes, hello, that was Halley," swishing by with impeccable timing. Even when a report is muddled clouds, fatigue, the scribe using the back of a letter because the good parchment is locked for Sunday, the sky's geometry puts tolerable limits on the muddle. Time slips are small and local. The way shoes make different squeaks on different floors. The larger steps line up. The heavens are not easily edited with a quill. Back on the ground, there is a different kind of astronomer, the paleographer, who studies letters the way birders study plumage. A long S-curve with a drooping tail hints at the 11th century. A particular way of punctuating a Latin sentence, dot over slash, leans toward the 12th. The smell of the parchment suggests whether the hide once belonged to a sheep who grazed in a damp valley. The work is patient, almost tactile. A scholar traces a flourish with a clean finger and murmurs, "French hand, northern, perhaps Picardy, notaries trained in Amiens." In their company, time becomes a texture rather than a number. Scripts do change across so-called phantom centuries, but not by miracle. They drift, they imitate. They get bored with themselves, and then fashion returns, a familiar loop. There is a reason handwriting guides exist for police and school children. Scripts avoid drama. If someone had chopped out a third of a millennium and pasted in a replacement, the letter forms would likely have cried out. Instead, they amble, as scripts do, through habit and habit's cousins. Numismatists join the party, carrying boxes of small, round arguments. Coins gossip about who ruled, who married, who shaved a little silver off the edge to stretch a budget. Their portraits, even when they are more ideal than accurate, evolve gradually with the same irresistible slouch as hairstyles and family albums. Mints open and close, mint marks migrate. Inscriptions change spelling slowly, as if each die cutter learned from the person at the next bench. Hoards are found sleeping in fields, each with a cutoff date that tells a story about trouble or thrift. A phantom century would require coins to play along across continents with admirable discipline. Mostly they do what coins always do. They jingle themselves into the ground and wait to be rediscovered by a person walking a dog. Then there are the guardians of very tiny things. Pollen analysts sit microscopes and count grain after grain. From lake mud, each grain shaped like a different button. When rye pollen surges, someone nearby was baking bread. When oak declines and birch rises, a woodland opened after a storm or an axe. In some lakes, you can read the medieval land use. Like a bar chart, only the chart is made of dust. A long lull and people would show up as a polite pause in rye. The pause does not arrive on cue for the phantom time. Verved lakes, those pancake stacks again, carry a rhythm that can be counted like a rosary. If society had removed 300 beads, the string would be short in the hand. It is not. The beads fall one by one with the patience of silt. Historians who question time are fond of edges, the edges of pages where a rubricator's red ink splashes into winter gray. The edges of settlements where a fence post leans at an angle that tells you wind and habit. The edges of maps where a coastline revised in one year and not in another shows whether a cartographer had the latest gossip from sailors. They like footnotes that lead to other footnotes the way sleep leads to dreams that lead to naps. A thoughtful few entertain the phantom idea as a useful game. What evidence would we expect if 3 centuries were invented? Could a scribe write an eclipse that never existed? How would a calendar reform leave fingerprints on rent day? They try on the hypothesis the way a tailor drapes a coat. Most shrug and set it back on the hanger. Parts fit elegantly. Others fall into a shape only wearable at a costume party. You can sense their relief in the prose. The world is complicated enough without extra centuries to argue about at lunch. The modern skeptics, the ones who poke gently at the official centuries, tell their students a practical rule. Assume mess before malice. A monk miscopied a number. A notary counted feast days instead of market days. A chronicles in the 3rd year refers to the 3rd year of someone's reign and not of the Lord. And the someone is not named because everyone local already knew. Burned archives and mildew do more to upset our chronology than emperors with telescopic vanity. When big corrections arrive, they come from uncharismatic places. A beam's ring pattern, a bubble in ice, a ministerial decree about tithes mentioning a comet by accident because it upset the sheep. One historian likes to keep a bowl of beans on his desk to move from one dish to another while counting annals. Another prints each year on a sticky note and rearranges them on the wall until the pattern stops bothering her. It is not glamorous, it is beautifully dull. People fall asleep in these offices and no one is offended. As for the boldest challengers, the ones who say the ledger is wrong at its spine, they are given a chair at the seminar table and plenty of tea. Their slides are viewed, their citations are checked. Their colleagues reply with gentle objections disguised as compliments. This is elegant, says someone, pointing at a diagram. But how do you get the tree in Norfolk to die when it did not die? Would you ask the Greenland ice to forget a volcano? The room hums. The projector whirs. A note is made to look again at a charter where the pig-shaped boundary stone appears because everyone enjoys that stone. When the meeting ends, the clock continues as it always did, ticking a little fast. No grand conspiracy is caught. No grand conspiracy is needed. The mystery is a sedative, not a solution. If, while all this unfolds, you drift, that is all right. The people who dare to question time are not going anywhere quickly. They will be in the archives tomorrow, greeting the attendant who knows which lights flicker. They will be in the lab, calibrating the machine with a standard that has been calibrated with another standard that knows a tree by name. They will be under the night sky with a folding chair, noting the stars with a pencil because pens freeze. And they will come home and put the kettle on and check the calendar stuck to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a cat. On it, someone has circled Thursday. The note says simply bread. This too is chronology, the regular appointment between flour and heat. Whether a century hides or not, the loaf rises at the same pace as always, and the house smells like proof that the present is enough. You might not expect a person to spend an afternoon politely arguing with a number, but that is more or less what some historians do. In cardigans that refuse to wrinkle and shoes chosen for libraries with very long corridors. They lift a sheet of paper, read a date like 733, and tilt it as if the number will confess from a different angle. They turn the page and find 734, which feels suspiciously confident, the way a well-behaved child smiles at a jar of jam. Then they check the ink, whose brown has settled into the fibers like tea into cotton. They breathe across the surface and watch the letters go a shade darker, as if waking. A crumb of wax at the edge hints that this page once rested near a candle. A thumb smudge at the bottom corner says someone in the past also read to the end. And the historian, who has come here to question the official centuries with the same tone a gardener uses for coaxing a vine around a trellis, writes a tiny note. In pencil, possible miscount of regnal years. Recheck anno. If you're still awake by the time we arrive at the International Committee for Leap Seconds, a real committee that exists. For people who negotiate with the planet's rotation, feel free to subscribe or don't. I'll keep murmuring to documents that answer at the speed of paper. There is a small, gentle culture among these doubters of chronology, people who put a question mark after a century and then make tea. They enjoy footnotes that cite other footnotes as if they were cousins who keep visiting unannounced. They keep bean jars on desks for counting annals, moving one bean for each year like an abacus that prefers soup. One keeps his beans in an old jam jar labeled years that behaved, another in a jar labeled years that might be cousins wearing the same hat. They bring magnifying glasses that clip onto glasses, and soft erasers that never squeak, and pencils sharpened to a diplomatic point. They have a ritual before opening a medieval register: exhale, brush, lift, and then that small, shared silence. Peculiar to those who can hear dust. Their skepticism is rarely dramatic. It shows up as a polite margin note, a new reading of a cramped numeral that was never as clear as everyone pretended, or a sigh when a previous scholar has helpfully underlined. Something with iron gall ink that ate the page like a meticulous moth. The heroics happen in the patience, not in the plot. From time to time they leave the archive and do field work in the wild, which in this profession means a church roof space or the back room of a town hall where bundles of parchment are tied, with twine that remembers the year it was tied. They interview clocks, which is to say they wind and compare them, listening to ticks that drift like small rowing boats. They stand at noon in the market square to see where shadows fall, because the old meridian line is still carved into a paving stone that no one notices except on days like this. They ask the bell ringer whether the bell has always sounded 3 minutes after noon, and receive a confident yes, and then a thoughtful no, and then a story about the bell rope, which broke in 1962 and shortened the tone by exactly the amount needed to confuse any argument. Out in the churchyard, they examine a boundary stone shaped like a pig, still standing at the prescribed angle, because an ancient charter demanded a pig-shaped stone, and the community acting as communities do, provided exactly that. The stone is comically literal and unreasonably moving. A timeline will bend for a king, perhaps, but not for a pig who minds its corner. At conferences, which are not the glamorous scenes people imagine except for the name tags with lanyards that lie, perfectly flat, these historians who dare to question time present their doubts in calm, adjustable fonts. A slide reads, "On the placement of the Northumbrian eclipse," and the next reads, "A note on tallies and tallies of tallies," and someone in the third row scribbles a star in the margin with the joy of realizing they will be thinking about tallies all week. The questions afterward are less like debates and more like knitting advice. Have you tried reading the charter against the bishop's itinerary? One asks because bishops used to travel like very punctual clouds. Did the scribe use the same ink for the number and the name? Another asks because sometimes numbers were patched in during tidy campaigns. No one throws a glove. Someone offers biscuits. In a corner, two graduate students compare pencil sharpeners with the seriousness generally reserved for dueling pistols. If skepticism keeps revolutions in other fields, in history it mostly keeps small Tupperware boxes with labels such as Fragment B, possibly upside down. The doubt that animates them is hospitable rather than destructive. It leaves the door open for a better reading, then puts on the kettle in case the better reading arrives wet. When a chronology wobbles, they do not gleefully kick it over. They fetch the level and a stack of folded paper, shim in hand, and see. Whether the wobble is a missing market day or a clerk distracted by a fly, they are perfectly willing to imagine a larger mistake if the evidence points that way, but the evidence tends, with a kind of domestic stubbornness, to prefer little mistakes that accumulate like socks behind a radiator. A mislabeled feast day here, a double-counted rain there, an eclipse observed through low cloud that turned totality into a rumor. If a century has gone astray, they expect to find it not hidden by a cabal, but mislaid by that steady alliance of rain, mice, and the human tendency to write things down just a little later than ideal. In the second, slower movement of our midnight lecture, we follow one of these skeptics into a room that smells faintly of vellum and lemon oil. They are not here to topple centuries. They are here for one word on one line that doesn't look as tired as its neighbors. The page is a palimpsest, faint writing beneath faint writing, like two voices agreeing so well that you can barely tell they are separate. Under the light, the undertext shows a name that once mattered to someone urgently enough to scrape it away and write a prayer where a tax note used to be. Our historian traces the ghost letters with a cotton swab that leaves no trace and feels the odd vertigo that comes from remembering that erasure is also evidence. A scraped date replaced with a cleaner one tells you that someone cared a lot about the way the past would read in the future. The question is not whether we were lied to, but which part of the truth was deemed inelegant on a Tuesday afternoon in a parish office. The scribes were not villains. They were the sort of people who tidy their desks before going home and put a little extra ink on the date because clarity feels virtuous. On the next table sits a set of wooden tallies, split sticks with matching notches that fit together like a marriage of twigs. Tallies were receipts you could break in half and keep honestly because no one could fake the fit. Historians like to pair them and whisper as if reuniting old friends. When two halves hug perfectly, the room feels for a second like a math problem that chose to be a poem. Our skeptic notes the date on the tally not a year, but a saint's day then hunts the same day in a ledger that has had its centuries converted by a clerk with a fondness for arithmetic done in the margin. The tally and the ledger sigh in the same key. Somewhere, a theory about an invented period checks its watch and decides to step out for air. It is hard to pretend 300 years are a trick when two ends of a stick kiss across time. But let's indulge the last question. because it is the last episode, and bedtime is most amused by thought experiments that put pillows under ordinary objects. What if it's all a lie? Not every bit, but the stretch everyone worries about. The suspicious run of years from the silence after one empire to the bustle of early chronicles. Suppose a sovereign, bored on a winter evening, commanded the monks to invent a century and a half, like adding a corridor to a house so that portraits have somewhere to live. Wouldn't we notice? Perhaps not at first. The daily calendars of the living would continue to do what calendars always do. Tell bakers when to proof dough and fishermen when to mend nets. No clerk looks at a page and thinks time has been invented. They think, is it Thursday and where did I put the seal? The sky hardly cares. An eclipse would still lurch across the afternoon in whatever year it felt like. The lie would need to coordinate the heavens, which are famously disobedient to paperwork. If it's all a lie, then it is the kind of lie that convinced trees to grow rings in exactly the right places, lakes to drop one pale layer of silt every winter like a forgetful, angel making beds, and ice in Greenland to capture bits of old volcano, breath on a schedule that agrees with a Chinese courtier's note about a red sun. It is a lie that taught coin dies to adopt fashions gradually, and scribes to become bored with exactly the same abbreviations at exactly the same time in monasteries that could not have colluded unless their pigeons were more efficient than email. It is a lie that persuaded a floorboard in a house by a river to creak since the 7th century with the weary dignity of old timber. A grand deception can wrangle people for a season. It cannot bully pollen. Pollen belongs to the union of tiny, stubborn facts. Still, let us stay with the game because it is pleasant to fall asleep inside a well-behaved paradox. If the centuries were invented, then you and I might be living in, say, 1727, which is a fine year with a crispness to its digits and room for a wig. The implication is not that your phone must vanish, but that it would be a very talented snuff box. Coffee houses would experience a sudden and confusing upgrade, though, to be fair, the 18th century already knew how to argue over hot beverages for hours at a time with gusto. Pachyderms in the menagerie would be startled by podcasts. The postal system would clap, relieved, at a device that sends letters to oneself instantly. And yet, even in 1727, the same human rhythms persist. Market day on Thursdays in towns with a preference for Thursdays. Laundry on Mondays because everyone said so. A bell at noon. And a cat deciding that the warmest place to sleep is the folded. Map of the county dot in this invented century world. The most noticeable difference would be the way candles give in at the edges at 2 a.m. The historian would be the same person, only with damp shoes and a quill that needs trimming. They would still argue with numbers, only now the numbers would be on parchment that curls like the crust of a well-baked pie. They would still doubt kindly because kindness is the most efficient way to make a date tell you what it meant. They would still carry beans for counting and still write, and a hand trained by candlelight. The phrase recheck annal in a margin where a monk had already written dies providebit, which is monk for it will work out. And when they raised their head from the page to rest their eyes, the same moon would be practicing the same choreography. Out the narrow window dot, the nice thing about this what if is that it fades by itself. The longer you imagine living inside a fabricated stretch of time, the more your attention slides off the big claim and lands on the coaster rings on the desk. The ring of the bell, the ring of tree growth under your feet in the hall where the floorboards speak their floorboard language. The present is remarkably good at being the present. If someone told bread to remember a conspiracy, it would rise in the bowl, forget it once, and rise again. Clocks are slightly more anxious, but even they accept adjustments with the forbearance of dogs who have been told gently that we are taking a different route today. Whether a scribe once invented a century has no effect on the fact that the thus real or hypothetical comes when it comes not. So the historians who dare to question time keep questioning, not because they expect to uncover a master plan executed by a very bored emperor with a fondness for round numbers, but because the work of questioning keeps the world honest at the scale that matters. They sharpen pencils. They make lists of saints to translate into weekdays. They visit clocks and say, "How are you ticking?" And the clocks reply, "Thank you for asking." They check the eclipse tables in the back of an almanac that smells like dried apples. They send courteous emails that begin, "Forgive a small inquiry," about your dating of the charter known as, and they end with gratitude for your patience, and they mean it every time. Their doubts are a service, the way a night watch is a service. You may sleep while they walk, and when they are tired, as every careful person is by evening, they put the lid on the bean jar, slide the magnifier into its pouch, and stack the photocopies in tidy order so tomorrow's certainty can find its place beside today's question. On the way out, they look at the wall calendar, which insists it is Thursday again. They pat their coat pocket to make sure the little pencil is there, which it is like a short, reliable friend. Outside, the air has that after-hours quiet that turns even a city into an archive. A cat crosses the street and decides that the historian is a moving warm object worthy of escort to the corner. The moon, which has seen centuries pass without once asking for a receipt, lifts over the roofline. The hour is both ancient and new. The documents will wait. The questions will wait. The beans will wait in their jar like years content to be. Counted. If you are still awake, let the numbers blur, let the invented centuries, if any ever were invented, dissolve into the soft grammar of breath, and let the last thought be an uncomplicated one. Tomorrow we'll have a noon and a bell, and a small, useful doubt, and that is more than enough.